I wanted to get into Dan Quinn as a CEO. This is something Ben Standig wrote about on his Substack, Last Man Standig. And he kind of points out the fact, Danny, that Quinn goes out and he hires David Blau, who's going to run the offense. And Quinn, because he's a defensive-minded guy, is very rarely going to be overly involved on that side of the ball. During the week, he's going to make some visits down to the office maybe and make some suggestions for a guy like Cliff Kingsbury or for David Blau, but it's not going to be his cup of tea. And so the thought was, well, maybe, depending on who he brings in here, if it's someone he knows really well, if it's someone who's going to run a Dan Quinn defense, he could still have his hands in on the defense like he did with Joe Witt, even before he took over play calling. But he went the opposite way. He went and got a guy to run his scheme in Durante Jones, which is not Dan Quinn's scheme at all. Quinn, in his press conference, said, I wanted to be very clear with Durante that this would be his system, Quinn said this week as Washington formally introduced Jones as the defensive coordinator. So Ben writes this up and says, look, if you're going to do the CEO thing, that's great, but last time, you didn't really. You kind of got heavily involved.
Yep.
You ended up play calling. You ended up being in the mix with Cliff Kingsbury. You ended up butting heads with him, apparently, because he's not running it the way you want it run. I thought that was an interesting way to look at this. Like, hey, you got to do a better job being the CEO if you're going to be just the CEO and you're not calling plays.
Yeah, so everybody's had this at various work experiences, right? Now, this is going to sound really negative, but one of the worst bosses I've ever had was not a mean person. They weren't like a tyrant or someone that screamed a lot or made everybody miserable, but they kept doing that. They kept getting down in the muck. The stuff that little old me, low on the totem pole guy, when I was 23 years old, that I should be doing, they were sticking their nose in that, right? And we're talking about the most minuscule bits of minutia when you need to be responsible for the big picture, empowering people to do their jobs. And it became painstaking and nothing got done, and it was always committee, and everything took too long. Instead of going, Grant, you got that? And you would say, yes, great, next item of business. They couldn't do it. That's what happens. That's a non-functioning organization. Now, that means you didn't hire the right people, or it means you don't trust them, you don't empower them, whatever it is. But we talk about that all the time. Empowering people to do their jobs effectively. So, A, we know when it doesn't work, who to blame. But B, when it does work, you don't really care about the credit because you hired the person, put them in a good spot. They succeed, it means you succeed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, the thing for me is there's not a great track record of Dan Quinn, highly successful CEO-style head coach. There just isn't. The Super Bowl trip in Atlanta happened under his CEO type watch, but that's kind of the list. That's the one check mark on the good side. Other than that, it's not like he's a master of clock management and timeouts and getting all the in-game decisions right and doing this, that, and the other. His teams don't look ultra prepared all the time. It's kind of like, okay, if you're going to be the CEO, dominate that role, and he hasn't.
I think that's the big takeaway first is if you're not going to call plays, then you really need to excel at the management part of this. Then that has to be a strength. If you're not outsmarting and outwitting, if you're not the coach that wins the chess match, so to speak, with scheme and play calling, that's fine. There's a lot of guys in the league that are not that type of coach. You don't have to be. But you've got to have some calling card. There has to be a reason that you differentiate yourself from the coaches that don't have a job. What is that? And if you are the best on the chart when we look at the timeout usage being proper, or if you're the best at deciding when to go or when not to on fourth down, or maybe you're most, the most successful when it comes to just managing game structure and being in a good position at the end of the game because you're coaching it like a basketball game by possessions and having the ball last. But these are not necessarily obvious strengths of his. So what I'm most interested in, though, is Quinn is a guy that I kind of thought was a pretty, he was perfidious. This is or I should say, the opposite of perfidious. He's not a disloyal guy. He's going to be extremely loyal to his assistants, right? And those assistant coaches that are gone now, I would have thought would have been here at least another year or two on the offensive side. By moving on, it tells you he wants something different. How involved is he going to be with Blau to get his vision? That's what I want to know. Do you just let Blau do his own thing? Do you let Blau run his own shop? Or is this kind of the Dan Quinn helping David Blau?
Yeah, the Blau-Quinn offense.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Here's how I want it done. Do the work, but this is what it's going to look like.
That's such a that by the way is the whatever dollar amount you want to put on it question about what the offense is going to look like this year, because there's a reason Cliff Kingsbury's not here anymore. It's the way I think it went down is we would like it to be different. Kingsbury goes, I don't do different. I do Cliff Kingsbury, and then he's not here anymore. So you'd think there's some input from the head coach who wants, and I think Peters too by extension, we want a certain style. We think that suits us best, both to complement the defense, to have more time in possession, to do this and this and this. And that didn't jive with what Cliff does. So now you got to plow here. Well, part of being a guy that's jumped up 4 or 5 stations before you're a quarterback's coach, before you're a pass game coordinator, before a lot of different things, is you're now kind of beholden to the guy that put you there. This sounds negative, but prematurely, right? Before maybe anybody else would have. I don't know what it would have come from in Detroit, or what would happen if he'd gone to Detroit for an interview, et cetera. Maybe it was a possibility. But you're now kind of, I don't want to say at the whim of Quinn, but there he is the big boss, and he's going to have some input there. This is not independent pelts-on-the-wall personality that's got a bunch of top 10 offenses in different cities. This is your first time doing this. What do you think, Skip? And then you get some influence.
Ben wrote on this, Danny. I want to get your thoughts on this. He says, the offense is not Quinn's area of expertise, but as head coach, he must focus more on that side of the ball this season, at least until Blau's comfort level is established. I think that's a given. I mean, that has to be the case. You can't just give a 30-year-old who's never been an OC and never called a play carte blanche to run half of a building and not have some type of oversight that you didn't have with Kingsbury. But he goes on to write here. This is Standig in his Substack. Jones is a first-time coordinator, but a coaching lifer, meaning Durante Jones. Moving on from Kingsbury represents a gamble, but it's nothing compared to replacing him with a high-qualified play caller, who is a high-qualified play caller, dazzled during the 2024 run to the NFC Championship game, with a 30-year-old who is yet to be a full-time position coach. Blau, a former quarterback, is only 2 years removed from his playing days. He goes on to say, Quinn would be deaf, dumb, or blind if issues arrive, but something had to give after Washington ranked among the worst defenses in numerous categories. So his point is, yeah, when it comes to Jones, he's not going to be unaware. He's not going to not react. If Jones needs some help, no problem.
Right.
But I believe Standig thinks he's actually going to be way more involved on the offensive side
think so too.
than the defensive side at the beginning of the year, which is crazy to think about.
Yeah.
But at least on the defensive side, even though it's another guy who's never called a play, he's been around forever. He has been at this longer. He has coached at every level, and he did call plays in college for a season with LSU.
Well, there's value in it. I'm telling you, the guys from the opposite side, having seen this up close with baseball, pitching coaches and hitting coaches, when you're in the office all day with each other, now you're, a few moments there's recruiting calls or emails you got to respond to, but listening to those guys talk to each other, what gives hitters problems? What gives pitchers problems? What don't they like to do? What do you want? You actually learn an awful lot by having how would you solve me? How would you combat this? What might somebody do? What gave you fits as a defensive coordinator? What is it about this Shanahan tree that pantses you every time you guys match up in a big game? Maybe I can incorporate some of that, et cetera. That can actually be incredibly helpful. I don't have a problem with that necessarily. I know it's not what Quinn specializes in, but stopping it is what he did specialize in. So I think that can be just fine. But it's a matter of, is David Blau going to be allowed to be full Blau, or is it like modified, watered down Blau part Quinn? That to me is the question of the year.
I think about Raheem Morris, who's coached on both sides of the ball, and under Quinn, I think, did both in Atlanta during his time there. I once wrote a story when I was doing some stuff for The Athletic years ago about the Shanahan tree and the rise of some of the guys in that staff here under Kyle with Mike Shanahan that went on to flourish elsewhere, and why it was so different and why so many of those guys were having success. And one of the big things they talked about, Danny, is what you're saying, which is basically that the way Mike taught you to coach offense was to spend a lot of time learning defense. That until you could call plays and coach offense, you needed to master defensive concepts and coverages and how they're disguised and what the defensive coordinator is trying to do and how they're trying to think, basically. And until you were able to do that, you didn't get to climb the ladder on the offensive side of the ball. And so there is something to that. I mean, I do believe that there's some good that can come from that. But I guess my question is, do you think Dan Quinn, if things get off to a slow start, there's going to be bumps in the road. Guys like Sean McVay, in his first year or two as a play caller, they struggled. Do you think he's going to give Blau the runway necessary to make some of these mistakes and to figure this out without getting involved as a CEO? Is he able to do that in a year where it's super important for him? If you're off to a 1-3 start, a 2-4 start, now we're talking about him being asked about his job at the podium. He's going to want to go help Jones and Blau, and he probably should.
Yeah, my answer is no. Now, that's my best guess, but I'm basically saying I don't think – I think we're going to have way more Dan Quinn influence on this offense than I would want.